The scream cracked the apartment's quiet as Emily Carter clutched Lily against her chest. The narrator watched the room freeze as Ryan Walker spun, his jaw tight with wounded pride. Emily said, "Do not wake her again." Ryan laughed without warmth as keys scraped the door. The sirens outside thinned into a distant ribbon of sound. Lily said, "Mom," and tucked her face deeper into Emily's sweater. The narrator traced the years of double shifts that carved shadows under Emily's eyes. Ryan said, "You did this," and a picture frame trembled. Emily said, "Leave." The latch clicked, and the hall swallowed his footsteps. The narrator felt the air grow heavy with dust and old apologies. Emily steadied her breath and kissed Lily's hair. She said, "We're safe," and new safety had splinters. A glass on the counter rocked and settled. The narrator asked how far a mother will go when the ground moves. Emily set Lily down and reached for her phone. She said, "It ends now." Morning found the apartment smelling of rain and burnt toast. The narrator traced the line of quiet that followed a storm. Emily brewed coffee she barely tasted and watched the steam curl. Lily said, "Are we late?" and tugged on socks with careful focus. Emily said, "We're early," and checked the door twice. The narrator measured the fatigue in her knuckles. A message from Ryan blinked and vanished as Emily deleted it. She said, "Not today." The hallway outside hummed with footsteps and recycling bins. "I'm me." Lily said, "Can I bring my rabbit?" and tucked it into her backpack. The narrator marked the discipline in Emily's breath as she made a list on a sticky note. Bus fare, lunch, lawyer's name. Emily said, "We have a plan." The kettle clicked and a gull cried beyond the wet street. The day began without asking permission. Emily locked the door and led Lily out. She said, "We move forward." The bus groaned toward downtown as Emily stood with one hand on the rail. The narrator listened to the city rattle through her bones. Maya Thompson waved from a corner seat and shifted her tote. Maya said, "Sit with me." Emily smiled thinly and sat. The narrator noted the bruise of sleep loss under her eyes. Maya said, "You texted late." Emily said, "He showed up." The bus sighed at a light, and a cyclist skimmed past. Maya said, "File the report today." Emily said, "I will." The narrator felt the resolve stitch itself across her chest. Lily hummed to herself and counted the stops. Maya said, "I'm off at lunch if you need me." Emily said, "Thank you." The city glinted with damp steel and stubborn hope. The bus doors opened on a rush of air. Emily squeezed Maya's hand and rose. She said, "Time to work." At the office lobby, the marble floor mirrored hurried shoes. The narrator tracked the hush that lives under fluorescent buzz. Emily said, "I'll sign in," and steadied her ID. The receptionist glanced at the clock and at Emily's damp sleeves. An email pinged with the subject line she feared. Ryan said, "We're revisiting custody in her memory," and the words spread like ink. Emily said, "Noted," and pressed her tongue to her teeth. The elevator doors parted and carried her up like a slow tide. The narrator felt the building's weight rest on her shoulders. A co-worker nodded and looked away. Emily said later, to the small talk she could not hold. She opened her inbox and saw a message from someone she trusted. The attachment was copied to an address she did not recognize. She said, "Why did you forward this?" The clock ticked louder. The break room smelled of old coffee and new rumors. The narrator traced the hush between friendly smiles. Maya arrived with 2 paper cups and a searching look. Maya said, "You okay?" Emily said, "Someone forwarded my file." The microwave ticked as if counting secrets. Maya said, "Who?" Emily said, "The name looks masked." The narrator felt the floor tilt under quiet betrayal. Maya said, "It can trace it." Emily said after lunch. She stared at the bulletin board where policies tried to look kind. Lily's drawing of a sun peeked from her wallet and steadied her hands. Emily said, "He is pushing again." Maya said, "Then we push back." The narrator measured the courage in that small sentence. Cups cooled as decisions heated. Emily said, "I called a lawyer today." A door hissed closed, and the room held its breath. By noon, the inbox stacked like storm clouds, and Emily Carter paced the corridor with a legal pad. The narrator felt the sting of a subject line marked urgent. Daniel Price said, "We need to discuss your client file." Emily said, "Book a room." The elevator chimed like a warning bell. Rent circled her thoughts alongside lunch money and bus fare. The narrator watched her anchor herself with a breath. A voicemail from the school flashed and waited like a flare. Emily said, "One thing at a time." Daniel said, "There was an external forward from your account." The words clicked like handcuffs in her head. She said, "I did not authorize that." The printer coughed forms that smelled of toner and trouble. The narrator traced the thin thread of resolve she refused to drop. Emily said, "It can verify access logs." Daniel said, "Do it today." Her phone buzzed again and dragged her toward a new cliff. She said, "I will call the school now." The building hummed as if it knew more than it told. The school secretary spoke in a careful tone that clipped every word. The narrator felt the room narrow to the shape of a phone. Angela Ruiz said, "There was a pickup attempt today." Emily said, "Who tried?" The pause scraped. Angela said, "Ryan Walker, and he did not appear on the form." Emily said, "Lily is only released to me." The fluorescent hum sharpened like a blade. The narrator pictured a hallway with crayon suns and a locked door. Emily said, "Is she safe now?" Angela said, "She is in my office drawing." Relief landed and then slid away. The custody petition pulsed like a live wire. Emily said, "I will send updated documents." The clock ticked louder, counting heartbeats. Angela said, "Bring your ID at pickup." Emily said, "I will be there by 3. She ended the call and leaned into the cool wall. The narrator measured the distance between panic and action. Emily opened her calendar and erased a meeting. She said, "Everything waits for Lily." Ben Patel slid a stack of forms across a scarred desk and tapped the top page. The narrator traced the ink lines like trenches. Ben said, "We will file an emergency order today." Emily said, "He came to the school." Ben said, "That helps our motion." The office smelled of coffee and wet coats. Lily colored in the waiting area and hummed a tune that steadied the air. The narrator watched Emily sign with a hand that did not shake. Ben said, "Document the harassment and the email breach." Emily said, "My coworker will help with it." A memory of forwarded files pricked her like thorns. Ben said, "We need affidavits by Friday." Emily said, "You will have them." The copier whirred like a distant engine. The narrator set the stakes on the table with the pens. Ben said, "You have leverage if we move fast." Emily said, "We move now." She gathered the pages and her courage in one deliberate sweep. The window showed a sky the color of tin. Back at the office, the shared drive blinked and coughed up errors. The narrator heard the soft panic of missing paths. Emily said, "Where did the client notes go?" A cursor spun like a coin deciding fate. Maya Thompson stepped in and kept her voice low. Maya said, "I can pull the backups." Emily said, "Someone renamed the folder." The air tasted like dust and worry. The narrator tracked the careful way trust can crack without sound. Maya said, "I saw a login at midnight from a remote IP." Emily said, "Whose?" Maya's eyes flicked and settled. She said, "It could be Ryan if he guessed your email pattern." The clock stencil threw thin shadows across the desk. The narrator felt suspicion arrive and sit down uninvited. Emily said, "Did you forward anything last week?" Maya said, "Only to you." The word only rang longer than it should. Emily said, "Send me the log." The progress bar crawled like winter. Evening pressed against the bus windows as the city smeared into lights. The narrator sat with Emily in the long exhale between stops. Lily leaned on her side and traced fog hearts on the glass. Emily said, "We file tomorrow." Lily said, "Will the teacher be there?" Emily said, "Only if needed." A message from Ben landed with the time for court. The day stacked itself like boxes she could not drop. The narrator held the border where fear becomes fuel. Emily said, "We will change our locks." Lily nodded as if locks were charms. The driver announced the route with a tired voice. Emily said, "We get hot chocolate and finish homework." Lily said, "Then cartoons." The bus rattled and kept its secrets. The narrator measured the quiet victory of a plan. A cruiser slid past in the rain and colored the aisle with red light. Emily said, "I have you," and the words warmed the metal air. The stop cord whispered under her fingers. The courthouse steps glistened from morning rain as Emily Carter adjusted Lily's backpack strap. Tut. The narrator followed the steady pulse of traffic, mixing with nerves. Ben Patel said, "Stay calm. Hearings are theater." Emily said, "He plays dirty." Ryan Walker leaned near the railing, his smirk a blade in daylight. The narrator measured how betrayal wore a suit and tie with ease. Lily said, "Can I draw inside?" Emily said, "Yes, sweetheart." She pressed her daughter's hand before Ben guided her to the security line. The hall loomed with marble that seemed built to swallow small voices. Emily said, "We fight today." Ben said, "We fight with proof." The narrator traced each step, echoing as if carrying both fear and resolve. Inside the courtroom, rows of wooden benches creaked with anxious weight. The narrator noted the gavel resting like an omen. Judge Karen Mills adjusted her glasses and scanned the docket. She said, "Case 1472, Carter versus Walker." Emily inhaled sharply, her pulse like a drum. Ryan whispered to his attorney, smirking as if he already won. The narrator felt the chill of power tilt toward him. Ben leaned and said, "Focus on facts." Emily said, "He twists facts." The bailiff's voice cut the air with clipped commands. Lily clutched her drawing pad in the gallery, eyes wide but brave. The narrator measured how innocence steadies, even under fluorescent glare. The hearing began, words ready to cut. Ryan's attorney stood and spoke with rehearsed ease. The narrator caught each word, sharpened like glass. He said, "Mr. Walker offers stability, financial security, and consistency." Emily's chest tightened, yet her gaze never left the bench. The narrator noted the way truth trembles when painted over. Ben rose and said, "We present evidence of harassment, unauthorized school approach, and email tampering." Emily nodded, each word like a stone placed on her side of the scale. Ryan's smirk faltered. Lily drew a sun with bright rays as if the courtroom walls could not cage her hope. Emily whispered, "Hold on," and the narrator felt her voice carry more than words. The judge raised a brow as Emily was called to testify. The narrator traced the hush that fell like a curtain. Emily said, "I work 2 jobs, and every choice has been for my daughter." Her voice steadied, though her palms sweated. Ryan shifted, eyes narrowing. The narrator felt the weight of unspoken battles pressing on her shoulders. Emily continued, "He came to her school unannounced. He forwarded my legal documents without consent." Judge Mills said, "Do you have evidence?" Ben slid a folder forward. The pages clicked as the judge turned them. The narrator marked how courage sounded quiet, but rang like a bell. As the session adjourned, the gavel struck like thunder. The narrator followed the echo fading across stone walls. Judge Mills said, "We reconvene Friday with testimony from the school." Emily exhaled slowly, the breath of a fighter still standing. Ryan brushed past, muttering, "You will not win." Emily said, "This isn't a game." Lily ran to her side, clutching the drawing of the sun. The narrator saw warmth flicker in Emily's tired eyes. Ben said, "We gained ground today." Emily nodded, though her chest carried bruises of doubt. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. The narrator whispered that storms break, but battles remain. Emily said, "We keep going." The cafeteria buzzed with voices that carried fragments of gossip. The narrator followed Emily Carter as she set her tray down across from Maya Thompson. Emily said, "Someone is feeding Ryan my files." Maya's eyes narrowed, her fork hovering. She said, "Do you think it's someone here?" Emily said, "The logs point inside." The narrator felt the room tilt with invisible weight. Maya said, "Why would anyone help him?" Emily said, "Leverage or money." A burst of laughter from another table felt sharp, out of place. The narrator marked the unease sliding under Emily's ribs. Maya said, "Check the permissions tonight." Emily nodded, chewing but not tasting. A text buzzed. "Ryan. Nice testimony." Emily's grip tightened, screen cracking faintly. She said, "He is taunting me." The narrator noted betrayal now came from both sides of the glass. At home, the apartment felt less like shelter and more like a cage. The narrator counted the locks. Emily checked twice. Lily asked, "Why are you sad?" Emily said, "Just tired, baby." She tucked her daughter into bed with a kiss heavy with fear. The phone rang again, number blocked. Emily whispered, "Stop calling me," and hung up. The narrator tracked the silence that followed, louder than sirens. She opened her laptop and scrolled through system logs. There it was, forwarded to Maya's account. Emily's breath caught. She said, "Why would she?" Her mind spun, but Lily stirred in the next room, muttering in sleep. The narrator measured the weight of betrayal seeping through walls, thinner than trust. Emily closed the laptop with a click that felt final. The next morning, Emily cornered Maya near the elevators. The narrator felt the hum of tension rising with the cables. Emily said, "Why is my file in your inbox?" Maya froze, lips parting before words formed. She said, "I only opened what came through." Emily said, "It was addressed to you." The narrator mocked a tremor in Maya's shoulders. Maya said, "I swear I never sent it further." Emily's eyes searched for cracks in truth. Ryan's smirk echoed in memory, his threats weaving through silence. The elevator dinged, doors sliding open to coworkers unaware. Maya said, "Please, believe me." Emily stepped back, breath shallow. She said, "Prove it then." The narrator traced how friendship bent toward breaking, the wires straining under suspicion. By evening, the lawyer's office smelled of stale coffee and ink. The narrator watched Emily pace as Ben Patel read the logs. Ben said, "This confirms an internal breach." Emily said, "Maya swears she's innocent." Ben said, "Then someone masked the sender." The narrator noted the way relief mingled with dread. Emily said, "He is closer than I thought." Ben said, "We will subpoena the IP records." Lily sat in the corner, coloring a house with walls too bright for the room. Emily said, "She deserves safety." Ben said, "And you will give it to her." The narrator followed the scratch of crayons against paper, louder than the buzz of fluorescent light. Emily's shoulders eased, but only for a breath. The storm broke that night, thunder shaking the apartment. The narrator listened as Emily sat at the window, phone in hand. A message lit the screen. "You cannot win." Emily whispered, "Watch me." The narrator measured how courage burned brighter in darkness. When she opened Lily's door quietly, watching her child breathe safely in sleep. Emily said, "He will not touch you again." Outside, lightning split the sky, sharp and raw. The narrator saw her face in the reflection, no longer just tired but hardened. Betrayal had carved lines but left steel beneath. Emily set the phone aside, her eyes dry, her back straight. She said, "I fight tomorrow harder than today." The storm rolled, and she did not flinch. The knock on the door was softer than thunder, but heavier than silence. The narrator followed Emily Carter's hand as it hovered before unlocking. A voice said, "It's me, Aunt Grace." Emily froze, years collapsing in a single breath. Grace Miller stepped into the light, her face carrying both age and apology. Emily said, "I thought you were gone." Grace said, "I never stopped watching." The narrator traced the fragile bridge between past and present. Lily peeked around the sofa, wide-eyed. Emily whispered, "This is your aunt." Lily said, "I have an aunt?" Grace knelt, tears breaking her composure. Emily's guard wavered but did not fall. The narrator felt the weight of old secrets press between them. Grace said, "I can help with Ryan." Emily said, "At what cost?" The room tightened with memory and possibility. At the kitchen table, steam rose from mugs untouched. The narrator counted the pauses that spoke louder than words. Emily said, "You vanished when I needed you." Grace lowered her gaze. She said, "I was forced out by choices I regret." Emily clenched her hands until the knuckles paled. The narrator marked the fracture of trust, trembling in the air. Grace said, "I kept records, proof of Ryan's lies, even of debts he hides." Emily said, "Why now?" Grace said, "Because he will destroy you if I don't." Lily scribbled on a napkin, humming, too young to know the history unfolding. The narrator held the silence stretched across the table like glass. Emily said, "Show me the proof." Grace slid a folder forward, edges frayed with years. The folder cracked open, releasing ghosts. The narrator read over Emily's shoulder, loan defaults, bank letters, a record of trespasses Ryan had buried. Emily said, "How did you get these?" Grace said, "I worked in his lawyer's office years ago." The confession hung heavy. The narrator traced the web of hidden loyalty. Emily's breath came uneven. She said, "This could change everything." Grace said, "Use it, even if it means exposing me." Lily whispered, "Mom." Emily closed the folder gently. She said, "This fight is mine, but thank you." Grace's eyes glistened, her silence speaking louder. The narrator marked the birth of a fragile alliance, stitched with secrets. Emily said, "We go to Ben tomorrow." At Ben Patel's office, the city hummed outside like a restless drum. The narrator watched him scan the folder, brows furrowed. Ben said, "This is strong, financial fraud, hidden accounts, enough to challenge custody." Emily said, "Then we file it." Grace sat in silence, her hands folded tight. The narrator felt her guilt seep through the room. Ben said, "But disclosure means she is exposed." Emily's eyes flicked to Grace. Emily said, "She risked enough already." The lawyer sighed, stacking papers carefully. He said, "This could shift the case." The narrator marked the tremor of possibility rising. Emily said, "Then shift it." Evening found Emily walking Lily home past neon-lit storefronts. The narrator felt the cool wind tug at her coat. Lily said, "Do you trust Aunt Grace?" Emily said, "I want to." The words weighed heavier than footsteps. Lily said she smiled at me. Emily said, "She means well." The narrator marked the fragile hope in her tone. Grace walked behind them, her silhouette softened by streetlight glow. She said, "I will stay near until this is over." Emily nodded, still uncertain. The neon flickered, painting the sidewalk in fractured colors. The narrator traced how betrayal and redemption walked side by side. Emily whispered, "We are stronger now," as Lily gripped her hand tighter. The courtroom felt heavier than before, its walls echoing with anticipation. The narrator measured the tension stretched like wire. Emily Carter gripped her folder, her knuckles pale, her breath steady despite her heart's pace. Ben Patel said, "This is where everything converges." Emily nodded, eyes fixed on Judge Karen Mills, who adjusted her glasses with calm gravity. Ryan Walker leaned close to his lawyer, whispering like venom carried on air. The narrator watched his smirk return, though thinner than before. Emily said, "He cannot hide anymore." Lily sat in the gallery, clutching her drawing of a son, her presence a reminder of what was at stake. The narrator traced how innocence anchored courage. Grace Miller shifted in the back row, her face drawn with guilt but firm resolve. Judge Mills raised her gavel. She said, we will hear final testimony. The narrator followed the silence that descended, sharper than any storm, as the hearing began in earnest. Ryan's lawyer rose first, his tone polished like glass, words meant to cut without blood. The narrator caught the rhythm of persuasion dressed as reason. He said, "Mr. Walker has demonstrated stability and financial security, crucial for the child's welfare." Emily's pulse raced, but she lifted her chin, unflinching. The narrator measured her silence heavy with unspoken truths. Ryan folded his hands, pretending calm, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of strain. Lily shifted in her seat, her small legs swinging nervously. Emily whispered to herself, "He will not win this with lies." Judge Mills scribbled notes, her face unreadable. The narrator marked how every phrase built scaffolding for a decision. Emily glanced at Grace, who gave the smallest nod, as if to remind her that proof still waited to surface. Ben Patel stood, his voice firm but edged with urgency. The narrator traced each syllable as it carved through air thick with tension. Ben said, "We present evidence of harassment, unauthorized school contact, and financial fraud deliberately concealed." Gasps rippled as he laid out the folder Grace had provided. Emily's breath steadied, her shoulders squared. Ryan shifted sharply, his mask cracking. The narrator watched his smirk collapse under weight. Judge Mills adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. She said, "These are serious allegations. The court will review." Emily whispered finally, though her lips barely moved. Lily gripped her drawing tighter, her eyes bright with unspoken hope. Grace's hands trembled in her lap, the burden of her secret now laid bare. The narrator felt the scale tip, not yet decided, but heavier on truth's side. Emily took the stand, her voice steady though her pulse pounded. The narrator carried each word across the hushed room. Emily said, "Every choice I made was for my daughter. I worked double shifts, paid every bill, and kept her safe." She paused, locking eyes with Ryan. She said, "He came to her school unannounced. He forwarded my legal files without consent. He has debts he hides from this court." The narrator measured the ripple her words sent, undeniable and sharp. Ryan muttered, "Lies," but his voice cracked. Judge Mills raised her hand for silence. Emily inhaled deeply and finished, "I ask only to protect her." The narrator noted how the weight of truth filled the chamber more than any gavel could. The final gavel struck, thunderous in its clarity. The narrator felt the sound linger like a storm's last echo. Judge Mills said, "Custody remains with Miss Carter until full financial disclosures are resolved. Mr. Walker, your conduct is under investigation." Emily exhaled, tears pressing but not falling. Lily rushed into her arms, the drawing crumpling between them. Emily said, "We did it, baby." Ryan's face burned crimson, his fists clenched as bailiffs guided him back. Grace stood, eyes glistening, a silent apology now stitched with redemption. Ben said, "This is not the end, but it is a victory." The narrator marked the fragile triumph of a woman who refused to bend. Emily whispered to Lily, "We're safe for now." The courtroom emptied, but the air still hummed with the echo of her defiance. The apartment carried the hush of aftermath, every object heavy with memory. The narrator watched Emily Carter place Lily's backpack by the door with careful hands. Emily said, "We're home, baby." Lily said, "Are we really safe now?" Emily knelt, brushing hair from her daughter's face. She said, "Safer than yesterday." The rain outside softened to mist, the world exhaling. Grace Miller sat on the sofa, her coat draped over the arm, guilt and relief mingling in her eyes. She said, "I should go." Emily paused, the silence stretching before she said, "Stay tonight." The narrator felt the fragile threads of forgiveness weaving slowly. Lily yawned, leaning into Emily's arms. The hum of the city outside no longer felt like threat, but like life moving forward. The morning light poured through thin curtains, touching the apartment with new clarity. The narrator marked the shift, less fear, more fragile hope. Emily brewed coffee, its aroma filling the kitchen. Lily said, "Can we paint today?" Emily smiled faintly. She said, "Yes, we can." Grace stood by the window, watching the street below, shadows of her own regrets etched in her face. She said, "I never meant to abandon you." Emily said, "But you did." The narrator heard the sting in her voice soften as she added, "You came back when it mattered." Grace exhaled, eyes wet, and said, "Then let me stay." Lily carried her brushes to the table, her laughter rising like sunlight piercing cloud. The narrator traced the quiet of the gallery where Emily met Maya Thompson at lunch. Emily said, "You hurt me with your silence." Maya lowered her eyes, her scarf tight around her locks. She said, "I was scared of being dragged in." Emily said, "I needed you anyway." The words cut but carried no venom. Maya said, "I will fight with you now, if you'll let me." Emily studied her friend's face, then nodded once. She said, "I'll need allies, not shadows." The narrator measured how forgiveness felt jagged, yet necessary. Their hands touched across the table, not warm but not cold either, something rebuilding. The clatter of the cafe around them became background to a fragile truce. The lawyer's office smelled of ink and victory, muted by fatigue. The narrator stood with Emily as Ben Patel closed the final folder. Ben said, "Custody is secure. Ryan's finances will keep him busy in court for months." Emily exhaled, her shoulders lowering for the first time in weeks. She said, "It's over for now." Grace touched her niece's hand gently, her eyes glimmering. She said, "You gave her what I couldn't." Emily said, "We did it together." The narrator mocked how shared burdens soften when carried side by side. Lily colored at the side desk, humming. Ben smiled faintly, saying, "You fought harder than most ever could." Emily said, "Because I had no choice." The narrator carried her voice like a vow. The evening air carried the city's heartbeat as Emily stood at the window, her reflection steady. The narrator traced the stillness filling the room. Lily's soft breaths drifted from the bedroom, steady and safe. Emily touched the doorframe of her daughter's room, whispering, "We will be okay." She returned to the window, the skyline glowing with lights like scattered hope. Grace slept on the sofa, a guardian rediscovered. The narrator measured how scars do not vanish but become part of strength. Emily smiled, not the mask she had worn for years, but a true smile born of survival. She whispered, "We're stronger now, and we'll never stop fighting." The final hush settled, carrying defiance and peace in equal measure.